Thank you in particular for joining us. This is the Hearst Visiting Professionals Lecture. My name is Dr. Ellen Peters. I'm the Philip H. Knight Chair and Director of the Center for Science Communication Research. Our co-sponsors are who made today's event possible. It includes the U of O's Institute for Resilient Organizations, Communities, and Environments, the Oregon Humanities Center, and the Environmental Studies Department. We also received additional support from the Robert B. Frazier Distinguished Lecture and Journalism Writing Fund. As we are all aware, big problems like climate change demand widespread action. Science can point us towards solutions, but it takes engaging people through effective communication to be able to fully implement those solutions. In our quest to make complex science useful in order to improve people's lives, the Center for Science Communication Research focuses on how to talk and how to write about climate change so we can promote effective action instead of confusion. Climate change is already affecting people's health as well as the quality of their lives, and this is occurring all around the world. You don't have to look very far for examples even. In the past 6 weeks alone, we've seen 2 devastating hurricanes strike Florida. Hurricanes that were made more ferocious and deadly because of the warmer sea temperatures brought on by climate change. And when climate disasters happen anywhere in the world, whether it's a megafire, a tornado, a 100-year flood, or a hurricane, the effects disproportionately impact vulnerable populations. In the aftermath of Hurricane Helene and Milton, we saw how those living in mobile homes, many of them poor, elderly, or disabled, how they'd lost everything. Some of them, without the means to evacuate, lost their lives. And yet, there are powerful forces working to deny the impact of climate change, and in doing so, they endanger us all. No one understands this better than our speaker today. Today's speaker is Dr. Naomi Oreskes. She is a renowned historian of science and a leading voice in the discourse on climate change. Dr. Oreskes has dedicated her career to understanding the complexities of scientific communication and knowledge and their implications for policy and for society. Currently a professor of the history of science at Harvard University, Dr. Oreskes has made very significant contributions to our understanding of the interplay between science and public perception. Her groundbreaking work, including the influential book, The Merchants of Doubt, which was co-authored with Eric Conway, this groundbreaking work examines how a small group of scientists obscured the truth about important issues like tobacco use and climate change, and through that, shaping public opinion and delaying meaningful action. Dr. Oreskes advocates for the role of scientific integrity in informing policy decisions. Her research has illuminated the urgent need for transparency in science, particularly as we confront the existential threat posed by climate change. Through her work, she challenges us to recognize the importance of evidence-based decision-making in an era that is rife with misinformation. In addition to her academic pursuits, Dr. Oreskes engages with diverse audiences, sharing her insights at global conferences and in the popular media. Her commitment to public engagement underscores her belief that science must not only inform, but it also must inspire action. One result of this has been Time magazine naming her one of the 100 most influential climate leaders in business. Today, we are more than fortunate to hear from Dr. Oreskes as she shares her insights on the critical relationships between science, societal beliefs, American business interests, and the future of our planet. So please join me, if you would, in welcoming Dr. Naomi Oreskes.
Well, thank you, Ellen, for that warm introduction. Obviously, that's a very small topic. So I know I live in Oregon, but I'm going to channel my inner New Yorker and talk fast. So today I'm going to talk to you on the topic of how market fundamentalism, the ideology of market fundamentalism, has blocked climate action. So I want to start today by going back in time to the year 1988, when the New York Times on the front page, this is probably a lecture in journalism and communication, on the front page of the New York Times, global warming has begun, expert tells Senate. That expert was the NASA climate scientist, Jim Hansen, who testified in the U.S. Congress that he and his team at NASA were 99% certain that man-made climate change, not attributable to natural variability, was now detectable. The New York Times, a few months later, concluded the issue of an overheating world has suddenly moved to the forefront of public concern. This is 1988, before any of the students in this audience, or even some of the faculty in this audience, were born. And the issue had also become a matter of political and congressional concern. So in 1988, Colorado Senator Jim Worth and a group of other senators introduced the National Energy Policy Act to establish a national energy policy that will quickly reduce the generation of carbon dioxide and trace gases to slow the pace and degree of atmospheric warming. 4 years later, as some of you know, President George H.W. Bush signed the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, which committed its signatories to preventing dangerous anthropogenic interference with the climate system. And when he signed that document, President Bush I called on world leaders to translate the written document into concrete action to protect the planet. So what the heck happened? Why didn't we act on the signs? Why did we take those concrete steps that President Bush promised us so many years ago? Well, in our previous work, Eric Conway and I showed that the answer was not for lack of scientific information. I've just shown you. Scientists were already communicating this to the public and to Congress. It was not for lack of clear communication. But what we showed was that the emergence of this scientific consensus and this emerging political consensus led to a politically motivated campaign to cast doubt on the science and therefore prevent that concrete political action that President Bush promised. So this is the story that Eric and I told in our first book together, Emergence of Doubt, about a cadre of scientists who were not climate scientists. They were mostly physicists who cast doubt not just on climate science, but on a set of issues, tobacco smoke, the reality of acid rain, the reality of the ozone hole. And so the question we wanted to answer at that time, we started this work almost 20 years ago, why would intelligent, educated people deny basic scientific findings, deny scientific evidence? This is a question that today doesn't seem so shocking, but 20 years ago it felt more shocking than it does today, but it's still obviously very important. And especially about something as well established scientifically as the harms of tobacco, or as monumentally consequential as the stratospheric ozone hole. And the answer we found in that work was politics. That science denial in these cases really had nothing to do with the science. And by that I mean it wasn't based on problems in the science, such as inadequate data, sample sizes that were too small or models that were too uncertain. Those would be scientific problems. But it had everything to do with political ideology, and specifically the ideology of market fundamentalism, or what Ronald Reagan famously called the magic of the marketplace. So in the new book, we asked the question, where did market fundamentalism come from? And why did it have such a hold on these people? And why does it have such a hold so broadly that even today we struggle to have action on climate change because so many Americans and others have accepted climate change denial? So let me start by defining market fundamentalism. We define market fundamentalism, following George Soros and others who have written on it, as the belief in the so-called magic of the marketplace and the power and the efficacy of the free market. But it's not just about believing positively in the free market. It's also about a set of negative beliefs about government, a hostility to government action in the marketplace, especially government regulation. Market fundamentalists believe that the government needs to get out of the way and just let markets do their magic. And it's coupled as well, though, to a worry about government. The hostility to regulation is coupled to a worry that government regulation is a backdoor to socialism, communism, and other forms of tyrannical government. So market fundamentalists sometimes refer to environmentalists as watermelons, green on the outside, but red on the inside. I have thought about trying to get a green jacket with a red lining, so I feel like that could be fun. But and it's this worry about government overreach that explains why a scientific issue like the harms of tobacco use or carbon pollution gets, quote, politicized. Because in their view, these are political questions. It's our political system that is at stake. And this is the fundamental reason, and this is really important for science communication people, you cannot solve this problem by giving people more scientific facts. More scientific data doesn't solve the problem because it doesn't address this fundamental concern about government overreach. So where did market fundamentalism come from? And why did so many people accept it to the point they would reject well-established scientific evidence of serious harms? So the story we tell in the new book is a story about the history of a set of purposeful and coordinated programs by American business leaders to promote market fundamentalism in academia, in public education, in popular culture, and most importantly, in American politics. To convince us that free markets were essential to the American way of life, and that anything less than radical economic freedom was a threat to that way of life. What we show in the book is that industry groups and conservative business leaders used the same strategies throughout the 20th century to limit government protections for labor, including child labor, to prevent or limit regulation of industry, and in the book we look specifically at the regulation of electricity. In Merchants of Doubt, we looked at tobacco, to protect the private sector from responsibility for the external costs of their products like air pollution, water pollution, and climate change, and ultimately and importantly, to deny the reality of climate change and prevent the sort of political action that, back in 1992, looked at that time to be imminent. They did this by a set of efforts involving advertising, marketing, attempts to influence radio, film, television, and news coverage, a program to rewrite school and college textbooks, and successful attempts to influence university curricula. All of these different activities had the same goal. It was to persuade us that any compromised economic freedom, even something as seemingly reasonable, like decreasing child labor or regulating tobacco, threatens our other freedoms and therefore the American way of life. And this also helps to explain why climate change denial is so much more widespread here in the United States than in any other country in the world. And it culminated historically in the election of Ronald Reagan, who some of you may remember famously argued that government is not a solution to our problems, government is the problem. And the remaking of the Republican Party away from the Republican Party of Richard Nixon and Dwight Eisenhower that did believe in the power of environmental or other government regulation to the Republican Party we have today. But it's important to point out, and in the book we have spent a considerable amount of time on this, it's not just the Republican Party. This story is a bipartisan critique because this way of thinking also deeply influenced the Democratic Party as well. It influenced the Democratic Party to step back from its earlier commitments to use the power of the federal government to protect workers, consumers, and the environment. It was Bill Clinton, not Ronald Reagan, who said, the era of big government is over. And in the book, we argue that just as Rady represents a dramatic departure from the Republican Party that precedes him, in some ways, Bill Clinton also represents a dramatic departure from the Democratic Party that preceded him. So telling the story of a big myth required a big book. It's more than 500 pages, and you guys are academics, so you could read 500 pages, but I won't ask you to do that today or this evening. What I want to do today is simply to offer a portion of this history. It's actually a quite small portion, but I think it's an important one that invites us to consider how it is that we as a society have come to rely, what I would argue is too much on markets and not enough on government to address economic and social needs. So it's not an argument against markets. Eric and I think markets are very good at doing certain kinds of things like producing fun jackets to wear to talk, this nice little clicker, but really bad at satisfying other needs, such as healthcare, or dealing with market failures, such as climate change. So let me say a little bit more about exactly what this myth is. Like all good myths, it embeds several submyths. The first submyth is just the idea of the market, or even more, the free market. The idea that we can talk about something called the market or the marketplace as something that exists unto itself, that has agency and even wisdom. So we talk about the wisdom of markets. The reality, of course, is that markets are human institutions like universities or museums or marriage, They've been around since biblical times, so markets predate capitalism, and people have been setting the rules for how markets operate for just about as long. So there is no such thing as the free market. There never has been. And that ideal or that ideology is used to promote a certain set of claims that are deeply ahistorical. The second sub-myth has to do with the role of government. So people who believe in the magic of the marketplace will argue that government cannot improve on the functioning of markets. Governments can only interfere and get in the way. And this is why then they say that governments need to stay out of the way, lest they distort the market and prevent it from doing its magic. The reality, of course, is that governments have always been involved in markets. There are rules for the functioning of markets in Leviticus, in the Old Testament, and in many cases, governments have created markets. The United States government created the market for railroads, for example. In China today, the Chinese government is helping to create the market for wind power. Governments have also improved the functions of markets or filled needs that markets left unfulfilled with social programs like national health insurance or social security. The third sub-myth, and this is the most important part actually to explain the why question in this story, is what we call the indivisibility thesis. This is the argument that capitalism and freedom go hand in hand, are indivisible and inextricable. And therefore, and this is really the key to the argument, that any compromise to economic freedom potentially threatens political freedom as well. And we argue in the book that history shows that this is also untrue, that history has on many occasions proved this claim to be untrue. So what I want to focus today is on this latter argument, this argument linking capitalism and freedom, because it's been central to American conservative ideology really since the 1930s or even 1920s, and it continues to inform it today. So that story begins with Herbert Hoover, and this book, published in the 1930s, called The Challenge to Liberty. He also wrote an earlier book about American individualism that is also relevant, but this one really hits more centrally on this key point. So as you all know, Herbert Hoover lost the presidency in 1932 to Franklin Delano Roosevelt because of his conspicuous failure to deal with one of the greatest market failures of them all, which was the U.S. Great Depression, really the global depression. And historically, he has been viewed by many people as a failed president. Certainly that's what I was taught in school, because of his failure to address this giant, colossal crisis. But the reality is that Hoover remained very influential in the Republican Party and very influential in conservative business circles. And in 1934, he publishes this book, Challenge to Liberty, where he lays out the indivisibility thesis. He writes, "It holds both in principle and in experience that intellectual and spiritual freedoms cannot thrive except where there are also economic freedoms. It insists equally upon protections to all these freedoms, or there is no liberty." This argument then is taken up by quite a few different people, but one particularly influential and important one is this man, J. Howard Pugh. All of you have heard of the Pew Charitable Trust, and Pew Research Fund. So it's the same Pew, though they had different politics today. If you look on their website, you can find some very fine print where they say, "Our views are not those of our founder, J. Howard Pugh." J. Howard Pugh was a pretty virulent guy, very anti-racist, virulently racist, anti-Semitic, also very anti-Catholic. And in the book, we talk about a lot of his different activities. He's also the chairman of the Sun Oil Company, what we know today as Sunoco, so one of the most powerful corporations in America. And most importantly for our story, he's a leader in the National Association of Manufacturers, a trade group representing factory owners who play a central role in promoting the indivisibility thesis in America. In the 1920s, NAM was active in fighting laws to restrict child labor. They argued that child labor was a matter of freedom, not the freedom of the children, but the freedom of business owners to run their factories, their mines, and their mills as they saw fit, and the freedom of fathers to decide what was right for their own children. And they argued, well, child labor can't really be a bad thing because no loving father would willingly put their child in a dangerous situation. So obviously, child can't really be that dangerous. Well, lots of studies showed that it was that dangerous. In the 1930s, NAM launched a multi-million-dollar propaganda campaign targeted at teachers, ministers, and other community leaders and ordinary Americans to promote the indivisibility thesis. And they did this in an astonishing range of ways. In the book, we give examples of all these. Press releases, push polls, integration propaganda. I mean, it's really like this talk would be really great in a communications course to see the different mechanisms they use to get this idea out. Films, newsletters, magazines, cartoons, posters designed to be hung in factories and in schools. And today, though not incidentally, you may not be surprised to find that they still exist and they fight climate policy and carbon pollution regulation. So in 1939, NAB organized its arguments under the slogan, the tripod of freedom. And they declared, and this was at their annual meeting, December 39. So right after war has broken out in Europe, they say, in a world torn by war and dictatorship, Americans live at peace and in freedoms. The best assurance that we shall remain free and at peace is our faith in constitutional representative democracy, in free enterprise, and civil and religious liberty as inseparable fundamentals of freedom to be cherished and preserved. And one of the things we see in this whole thing, again, this is really relevant for communications people, very careful use of words. So up until this time, Kyle, there we go. I want to call your attention to this little phrase here. Up until this time, the phrase free enterprise wasn't really widely used in America. Most people, when they were talking about the private sector, would refer to private enterprise. But the NAM people said, well, a lot of people don't really like private things. It would be better to call it free enterprise. And so they begin to push the idea of using this term free enterprise, which then, of course, now today we talk about free enterprise all the time. So they promoted this argument in various formats and venues, but in their view, the most successful thing they did was a radio program, a syndicated radio program extolling the virtues of capitalism, of rugged individualism, of individual responsibility, and vilifying FDR and the New Deal. It was called The American Family Robinson, which was meant to invoke the novel The Swiss Family Robinson, about a Swiss family that gets shipwrecked on an island, but they survive through hard work and Protestant work ethic. The NAM internal documents they state that the purpose of the program was, quote, to present openly and as effectively and attractively as radio will permit the fundamental principle that freedom of speech and of the press, freedom of religion, and freedom of enterprise are inseparable. So this is really an argument against a lot of FDR's New Deal restrictions on labor, like minimum wage laws or maximum hour laws. And the documents are kind of fun, too, because there's one document we found where a radio executive at NBC says, this is overt propaganda. We can't possibly use this. And so they don't, but 300 radio stations in the United States do. And the viewer is never informed that this is wholly written, paid for, and sponsored by the National Association of Manufacturers. In 1948, we see the language of the indivisibility thesis emerging very clearly. So this is a letter that Pew writes to Rose Wilder Lane. How many of you here know who Rose Wilder Lane is? A few, but okay. So Rose Wilder Lane is one of these people who should be very famous. She actually wrote The Little House on the Prairie Crops. How many of you have read those books? Yeah, everyone. Right, so we all read those books growing up. They were marketed as the true life story of Laura Ingalls Wilder growing up on the American frontier. And there are multiple National Historic Monuments in this country, including in South Dakota, and I think there's one in Minnesota, marking these places where Laura Ingalls Wilder lived. Well, the Wilder family was real, and they really did live in those places, but the stories were actually written by Rose Wilder Lane, who was a libertarian novelist and journalist, close friends with J. Howard Herbert, who Ayn Rand, and a whole network of libertarian, like uber right-wing, almost crypto-anarchist philosophers. So this is a letter between her and J. Howard Pew. Pew writes back to her explaining his concept, and he says, I believe that freedom is indivisible. When a part is taken away, that which remains is no longer freedom. And the part he's worried about, of course, is not freedom of speech or religion, but it's industrial freedom, the freedom of businessmen to run their businesses as they see fit. And he's arguing that what FDR has done by compromising industrial freedom is to threaten carry out the conduct of industry. By controlling the conduct of industry, threaten freedom altogether. And then he goes on to talk about how great mass marketing is, Also the greatness of mass advertising. Anyone you're interested in marketing and advertising, this is like really great. So telling you how advertising is really key to American democracy. Okay, so you see what the argument is, you see how it's being laid out and developed. But Hugh and his colleagues faced a number of problems, particularly three big ones. The first was that the tripod of freedom argument wasn't true. So they were arguing that free enterprise was one of the foundations of this country, along with representative democracy and the freedoms instantiated in the Bill of Rights. But actually, free enterprise was not one of the basic concepts on which this country was founded. Unlike the Bill of Rights, unlike the structure of representative democracy, free enterprise, private enterprise appears nowhere in the Constitution, nowhere in the Declaration of Independence. And in fact, if you know anything about U.S. history, you know that government was deeply involved in the development of the American economy throughout its history. I mean, this is what Alexander Hamilton is most famous for. The indivisibility thesis was also hypocritical. Knapp, Pugh, Herbert Hoover, Rose Wilder Lane, and all these folks argued for businessmen's freedom, for industrial freedom, for businessmen to set wages and working conditions in the factories, including hiring child labor if they saw fit. But they fought bitterly and often violently against their workers' freedom to pursue, to unionize, or to engage in collective bargaining. And of course, the whole argument was self-serving. It was basically saying, just let us do our own thing. It'll be great for everyone. Don't be worried. But in the 1940s, while memories of the Great Depression were still bitter and vivid, it was really a little bit hard to swallow. As historian Wendy Wall has noted, in the wake of the economic collapse of the Great Depression, the, quote, narrative of capitalist-driven growth seemed questionable at best and a monstrous delusion at worst. So how do you get people to believe in an argument that is false, hypocritical, and self-serving? The answer is hire academics. They knew that their argument wasn't really, they'd spent, by the 1940s, late 1940s, they had spent many millions of dollars, tens, possibly hundreds of millions of dollars in this campaign. But polls showed the American people actually were not really buying it. So they concluded they needed intellectuals to bolster the case, to make it seem that it wasn't self-serving and hypocritical, to make it seem as if it was true. And so they recruited two of the founders of neoliberalism, two Austrian economists, the economist Friedrich von Hayek and the economist Ludwig von Mises, to come to America from Europe to promote these ideas and give them intellectual credibility. They financed positions for them at NYU and the University of Chicago, so these men were hired behind closed doors, without an advertisement, without an open competition, which I also find just charmingly hypocritical. These men who champion competition do not actually believe in competition when it comes to hiring the people they want at universities. So they financed the positions, and then they produced simplified versions of their arguments that were heavily promoted in popular contexts. And then they funded additional academics to refine the argument and carry it forward, particularly at the University of Chicago. So I want to talk a little bit more about these ideas and how they were used to promote the indivisibility thesis in the United States. So in many ways, von Hayek's 1944 book, The Road to Serfdom, was a sophisticated articulation of the indivisibility thesis. And we did a lot of work to try to figure out the chicken and egg relationships here. Did Nam and Pugh and these guys get the indivisibility thesis from Mises and Hayek? Or was it more that they came to it on their own devices and then realized that these guys have views that were really workable for them? And we were never able to prove that explicitly because we do know Nam was interacting with von Mises in the 30s and he was serving as a consultant. So it may be a little bit of a chicken and egg. I think that, so we weren't able to really prove that conclusively. But what we do know is that von Hayek's book was focused on the problem of Soviet communism, and particularly the problem of centrally planned economies. So one of the big questions in 1944 was what was going to happen to the European economies when the war ended? And would they slip back into depression, or were they going to somehow land on their feet? And there were people in Europe, particularly in England, arguing that the British government had to plan the economy going forward, otherwise it would slip back into depression. And so there was a big, vital, and important intellectual debate going on at this time about this issue. Von Hayek is responding to that argument and saying you absolutely must not turn to centralized planning, because if you do, you will end up like the Soviet Union. You will end up with a dictatorial, totalitarian state. And he suggests, but he goes further. He says, but it's not even just about centrally planning. Even in a non-communist society like the United Kingdom, where he's now living in 1944, if economic freedom is compromised, for example, by implementing a national health insurance system, it would put that society on the road to serfdom. And so therefore he argues strongly that the government should not take the steps to, say, offer national health insurance or address major areas that he thinks should be left to the private sector. So essentially it's a slippery slope argument. And it would later be used by the tobacco industry to fight tobacco taxes and tobacco regulation. And it's used today by many people fighting climate regulation. Now, one of the important things about this story, though, is that von Hayek is a sophisticated thinker. He's very intelligent. And, oh, wow. So out-time lighting. Okay, that's fine. If you read the whole book, and this is one reason why, call me stodgy or whatever, but I'm very upset by this trend in academic life where we just assign snippets of books, and our students are shocked if we ask them to read a whole book. But often if you don't read the whole book, you don't actually understand the whole argument. And this absolutely happened with von Hayek, but in this case, it happened deliberately because people took out the parts of the book that served their purposes and buried the rest. So von Hayek actually says, well, okay, you can't actually expect markets to do everything. There are certainly places where you need government. And so, we're back to daytime lighting. I thought the Hollywood lighting was kind of fun, but whatever the IT guys think is best. So he writes, but you have to get to page 86 of the book for this. He says, the successful use of competition as the principle of social organization, as opposed to central planning, precludes certain types of coercive interference with economic life, but it admits of and even requires others. So what is he thinking of? What kinds of interference does he think we need? Well, it turns out he's got a pretty long list. And most of them have to do with pollution. So he talks about deforestation, the harmful effects of deforestation, some methods of farming, the noise and smoke of factories, the use of poisonous substances. But he also talks about limiting working hours, preventing violence, signposts on roads. That's always my favorite one. There's a great line in a big conference on neoliberalism that happens after the war where someone says, being a neoliberal does not mean that cars can just drive in any direction they want. So he talks about signposts on roads, and that was some metaphor that Herbert Hoover had used as well. And he argues for some form of social insurance like Social Security, a program that conservatives love to hate. So he says there can be no question that adequate security against severe privation will have to be one of the main goals of policy. So he recognizes that some of the reforms that have been put in place in response to the Great Depression are absolutely necessary, and you absolutely have to have them. And he explicitly rejects the argument for laissez-faire. He says, it's important not to confuse opposition against planning with a dogmatic laissez-faire attitude. The liberal argument is in favor of making the best possible use of the forces of competition as a means of coordinating human efforts, not an argument for leaving things just as they are. But in the hands of his acolytes, it becomes an argument for laissez-faire, particularly when it comes to addressing the failures and social costs of poorly regulated capitalism. And in fact, it goes further because it takes on the quality of a religious faith. So some critics and reviewers have criticized us for using the term market fundamentalism because they think that's kind of inflammatory to accuse these folks, of having a kind of quasi-religious commitment. Well, I don't think we made that up. I'm an empirical historian. Everything we do is based on the empirical and historical evidence. So when von Hayek is brought to the United States, his supporters arranged for Reader's Digest version of his book to be published, obviously in Reader's Digest. It's a 20-page condensation. So they take this book that's 250 or 30 pages, and they reduce it to a much shorter, much more simplified version. It was published in 1945. The original text has no illustrations. The Reader's Digest text has one illustration, and it's this one. So here you can see The notion of political and economic rights focused on protection of the individual, which they call the American way of life, is explicitly inscribed as a kind of 10 Commandments. There's actually more than 10, and the really key one here is this last one, the right to freedom from, quote, arbitrary government regulation and control. And they argue that this is all founded on a fundamental belief in God. So it is religious, and it is linked to a specific form of religiosity, which is Protestant Christianity. In the book, we go into more details about the religious aspects. I'm not going to talk about that tonight. But that apparently was not enough. They go even further. And so then they turn it into a literal comic book, which was published, reproduced in Look magazine, major mass market circulation magazine at the time, and reproduced as a pamphlet that was distributed by the General Motors Corporation. And Alfred P. Sloan plays a big role in this story, too. Again, it's in the book. I won't talk about it tonight. But we see the names of many of the captains of industry, many of the most famous names in U.S. business history appear in the story, and Alfred Sloan is one of them. So with just a tiny bit of text, they take the whole argument of the book and reduce it to 18 pictures and captions. Although now they've changed it, rather than being about Soviet-style communism and centralized planning, now they shift the argument to begin with wartime planning in the United States. So it begins with war forcing national planning. This is the first picture, and it ends 17 pictures later with the dissenter being shot by a fighting squad. So you support FDR today, here's what will be tomorrow. Now, we know by his own account that in the 1950s, Ronald Reagan read from Hayek, and we would argue that the evidence suggests that he read the Reader's Digest version. Now, one thing that's tricky about this kind of work, I always say, in a way, the history that Eric and I do is supply-side history. We show how these arguments are constructed. We show how they're pumped out to the American people. It's really hard as a historian to get at the demand side, the receipt. Like, what do people think when they how many people saw these arguments? What did they think when they saw them? So in the book, we have a few examples where we actually are able to show people using some of these arguments, including an example of a Protestant minister in Tennessee who uses this in one of his Sunday sermons. But we weren't able to find good data on how many people these things reached. So the original book of The Road to Serfdom in England sold 17,000 copies. That was much better than the editor expected for what's actually a pretty sophisticated and somewhat difficult book. I mean, even today, 17,000 is really good for an academic book. But the circulation of Look magazine, where the cartoon version was published, was nearly 3 million copies. It was one of the most popular mass market magazines in America at that time. Lots of ordinary families received it in the mail every week. Reader's Digest had a circulation of nearly 9 million, and we know that 1 million more copies of the Reader's Digest adaptation were distributed as a pamphlet. And so for comparison, the population of the U.S. at this time is about 140 million. So the evidence is pretty good that they would have reached close to 10% of the American people, and maybe more. The key point of this argument is that in the Reader's Digest version and in the Cartesian version, all of Hayek's nuance and caveats and exceptions are expunged. All of his discussion of the legitimate forms of interference in the marketplace are removed. And so what you get is this doctrinaire argument against government action in the marketplace of any kind, even though that's not actually what Hayek thought. And then they do the same thing to Adam Smith. Now, you may not all have heard of von Hayek before you came here tonight, but how many people here have never heard of Adam Smith? No one. You've never heard of Adam Smith? Okay, one.
No, I have.
Oh, sorry, I deliberately phrased that as a negative. No one has not heard of Adam Smith, right? Super famous name, one of the most famous names in the history of Western thought, generally thought of as being the father of modern capitalism. So it matters to us what Adam Smith thought. Not that we necessarily have to be bound by it, but it's certainly important to understand the thinking of great thinkers. And so here's what happens next. So von Hayek was brought to the University of Chicago to be part of something called the Free Market Project. The idea was conceptualized and fully funded by a former executive at the DuPont Corporation, a man named Jasper Crane, working with a fellow named Harold Lunau, who was the head of the Libertarian Volcker Foundation, one of the first libertarian foundations in America. So, I mean, these are names that are not well known to history, but they've had a big impact in their role in helping to fund and shape the Chicago School of Economics. The idea they had was to fund an academic program at a prestigious university to develop a blueprint for, quote, an effective competitive system of free enterprise. The arguments were stipulated in advance, and again, this is in the documentary record. The research would be intended to demonstrate the primacy of the free market as, quote, the most efficient organizer of society, so not just the economy, but the whole society, and explaining that the free market is systematic, rational, not chaotic or disorderly, and consistently efficient in allocating resources to their best use. Also, the program would emphasize the relationship between capitalism and freedom, with an emphasis on regulation as, quote, a menace to the free market and therefore to freedom generally. So, imagine this. Some person now comes to the University of Oregon with a plan to support a research program to advocate these things stipulated in advance. Well, this may in fact be happening, I don't know, but a fun little detail in the story. So originally, Crane and Lunau talked to Jacob Viner, who's already at the University of Chicago, a very important economist. And Viner says, I really don't think that you can get any reputable university to agree to these terms. I mean, this is ridiculous. This isn't a research program. This is a propaganda program. And so Crane and Lunau go first to Princeton, and indeed, Princeton says, no way, we're not accepting those terms. And then they go to Chicago, and Chicago says yes. Okay, so I think I've already said that. Okay, so who were some of the participants in this program? Well, it's a pretty big project. It includes famous names like Robert Bork. In the book, we talk a bit about Bork and his role in the story. But I want to focus tonight on two key important thinkers, these men, George Stigler and Milton Friedman, both of whom became highly influential figures in the Chicago School of Economics, both of whom won Nobel Memorial Prizes in economics. In 1957, Stigler publishes an edited version of Adam Smith's classic work, The Wealth of Nations. And just as the edited version of The Road to Serfdom left out all Hayek's caveats, so did the Chicago School version of The Wealth of Nations. In fact, most of us don't even know there were caveats because either we never read The Wealth of Nations, or if we did, we read an expurgated version of it. Now, The Wealth of Nations is a giant book, over 1,000 pages in the facsimile edition, so obviously some things would have to be left out, especially in the edition that you're hoping to use in the classroom. But Stigler leaves out all of the passages where Smith recognized the limits of self-interest and the need for taxation, regulation, and restraints on self-interest to protect public safety. And these included extensive discussions in The Wealth of Nations of the importance of banking regulation, an issue we're still arguing about today, the importance of taxation, progressive taxation to support public goods like roads and bridges, the importance of minimum wage laws, and the rights of workers to unionize to counter the power of factory owners and level the playing field. So I want to talk a little bit about banking regulation because it's such an important issue and we're still having this discussion even today. In The Wealth of Nations, Smith offers an extensive discussion of why an effective capitalist system requires banking regulation. And the reason is simple, that without it, the self-interest of bankers will lead to bank runs and potentially wreck the economy. So, and he has a long discussion of this, which I don't have time to get into today, but again, he says, you can't trust bankers. Their self-interest will cause them to issue too much currency, make reckless speculations, reckless investments, and if banks begin to fail, the whole modern economy can come down with them, something that we saw almost happen in 2008. Now, he knows, even in 1776, he realizes that some of his readers would object to any regulation as a denial of freedom, a denial of liberty. And so in response, he offers a succinct summary of when regulation is warranted. And he says, quote, when the natural liberty of a few individuals endangers the security of the whole society. And I love that, because I feel like there it is. That, in a nutshell, is the argument for why we need governance on all kinds of levels. And he says reckless bankers do that, and therefore he concludes the application of building firewalls in order to prevent the communication of fire is a violation of natural liberty exactly of the same kind with the regulation of the banking trade, which are here proposed. And he goes on to say, but we all accept the importance of firewalls. After the Great Fire of London, nobody denies that you need firewalls. And he says you need them in banking as well. In other words, regulations are not just acceptable, they're not just a necessary evil, but they're actually productive and necessary when the actions of some individuals, or I would add today corporations, threaten the freedom, the safety, or security of the rest of us. Indeed, Jacob Weiler, who I just mentioned a few minutes ago, who was already a leading figure in the early Chicago School of Economics before World War II, before the rise of the free market project, wrote, "The modern advocate of laissez-faire, who objects to government participation in business on the grounds that it is an encroachment upon a field reserved by nature for private enterprise, cannot find support for this argument in the wealth of nations." And I love this quotation for many reasons, but especially some of you may remember encroachment was a favorite word of Ronald Reagan, right? Government encroachment is something he talked about all the time. So why don't more of us know this? Why do we think of Smith as this advocate of untrammeled self-interest, the hero of the Wall Street Journal, the hero of the Chicago School? But I would argue that that is, at least in part, because this is the version of Adam Smith that the late Chicago School created and sustained in American society, the version that the writers and editors of the Wall Street Journal and Forbes and Fortune, etc., would have learned when they were in school. And that then brings us to the last key figure in this story, which is the economist Milton Friedman. In 1962, Friedman publishes a very, very influential book called Capitalism and Freedom. It's essentially a restatement of The Road to Serfdom, but written for an American audience. And Lenow and Crane had hoped that Hart would actually rewrite The Road to Serfdom for an American audience with American examples. And at first he said, yeah, maybe he would. Then he says, no, he doesn't want to, he doesn't do it. But I would argue, we do argue in the book, that Friedman essentially does that. It's based on a series of lectures funded by the Volcker Fund, and we argue that it really is the blueprint for an effective competitive system of free enterprise that Crane and Lenow had planned for and paid for. The central argument is the same as the argument that you can find in The Road to Serfdom and that you can find in the work of Ludwig von Mises as well, that, quote, the great threat to freedom is the concentration of power in government. So by distributing power, the argument goes, the marketplace protects freedom. Therefore, capitalism protects freedom and compromises to capitalism threaten freedom. Well, you can see that's like lots of potentially logical flaws, but that's the argument. The argument of the book I thought was summarized best in a review in 1963 written by Leon Kaiserle, who had been the head of President Truman's Council of Economic Advisors, and he says, and he doesn't agree with the book, he disagrees adamantly with the book, but he says, the argument of the book is that freedom depends above all upon limiting the functions of government as closely as possible. So we see it is the indivisibility thesis, the argument that capitalism and freedom cannot be separated. Now, if you're not a conservative or libertarian, you may not know how influential these books have been, and if you are, then please stay with me. The Road to Serfdom has sold more than 2 million copies and been translated into 20 languages. Milton Friedman's book, last time I looked, about 1 million copies. Actually, I think that number is probably too low. I think it's more. It's been translated into 18 languages. But more to the point, these books have been heavily promoted in American conservative cultural and political circumstances, and by many of America's most prominent conservative voices. So some of you will recognize here, this is Glenn Beck on Fox News, and there's The Road to Serfdom in the background. And according to some figures I found, the next day on Amazon, 40,000 copies of the book were sold. So that's a staggering number of copies. Here's just a few different people who have promoted the book in public. Michelle Bachmann, the libertarian congresswoman, one time said that she read The Road to Serfdom on the beach. So I think that proves she's a liar. Nobody could read this book on the beach. But Ted Cruz, Paul Lyon, many names you know. In 1991, Hayek received the National Medal of Freedom from Ronald Reagan. George Bush called The Road to Serfdom a book that still thrills readers everywhere, proving he really was a weird guy. It's a very interesting book. I don't think most people would call it thrilling. But then it does. I can interrupt for one fun anecdote. When my first book, The Rejection of Continental Drift, was published, this is a very serious academic book, I got an email from someone in Scotland who told me that he had stayed up all night reading this book, a geologist. I told my family this story, and they're like, okay, that's a really weird guy. And then when Merchants of Doubt was published in Australia, the West Australian, the leading newspaper in Perth, Australia, the review said, a riveting page-turner. And I told my children this. By this point, they're teenagers, and my teenage daughter, who's about 15 at the time, looks at me and she goes, life must be really boring in West Australia. Okay, and Capitalism and Freedom, if you look up top 10 most important conservative books, you will find it on virtually every top 10 list of conservative books, and many top 100 books of all time, Time, the Times Liberty Supplement. And then Friedman became a columnist for Newsweek, where he wrote literally hundreds of editorials promoting free market thinking, laissez-faire. You may know also the notion of shareholder value, that the only responsibility of corporations is to maximize shareholder value. That came from Friedman. He served as an advisor to Margaret Thatcher, to Ronald Reagan, also to the Chilean dictator Augusto Pinochet. And in 1976, he won the Nobel Memorial Prize in economics. In fact, in the 1980s, Friedman became one of the most influential public intellectuals of the 20th century. We argue in part because he got a TV series. I mean, how many academics get their own TV shows? Him and Neil deGrasse Tyson, right? So, and it was called Free to Choose, and it was essentially laying out in, I thought, 10 parts, 11 parts, a lot of parts, the argument of the road to serfdom, the argument that any compromise to economic freedom threatens political freedom. It was funded by a libertarian businessman, Bob Chichester, and I had to do a lot of work to find this out. Normally, PBS, we're all used to those things at the end that says, made possible by grant from, the Park Foundation and support from viewers like you. There is nothing like that at the end of this series. You cannot tell who funded this. So I actually went back to the original TV station in Pennsylvania where it originated, and some nice person there answered my email and went into the file cabinets and found this out. So we also shared bloody researchers, bloody historians. You'll be amazed what you can learn when you just write an email to someone and say, hey, do you have any idea who funded this project? So, and he supported not just the TV series, but a full-fledged marketing campaign, including a companion book to explain the benefits of capitalism and political freedom to the world, and a foundation called the Free to Choose Network, which still exists today and still promotes Milton Friedman's work. And Friedman was awarded both the National Medal of Freedom and the National Medal of Science. Today, his ideas continue to be promulgated by a large network of free market and libertarian think tanks and foundations. This is just a list of some of them, but some of them you'll have heard of. Heritage Foundation, they're the people behind the Project 2025 stuff. Americans for Prosperity, other known as the Tea Party. So some of these groups are very famous. Others were a lot more behind the scenes. The de Tocqueville Institute did a lot of work to defend the tobacco industry. All of these groups have denied the scientific evidence of climate change, and many of them were involved in anti-masking and anti-vaccine issues during the pandemic. So in short, what we argue in the book is that the members of NAM, the National Association of Manufacturers, didn't just manufacture cars and carpets. They manufactured a myth. And they spent the ensuing decades burnishing its intellectual credentials, making it seem intellectually valid, and embedding it into politics and popular culture. And I haven't had time today to talk about film, TV, radio, but in the book we have a pretty big discussion about Hollywood, and we have a discussion about the way NAM, particularly Pew, worked to embed this into Protestant religious views and popular culture, and then, of course, politics through Ronald Reagan. So one question that you might legitimately ask is, well, how do we know this was propaganda? How do we distinguish between propaganda and legitimate political or academic opinion? This is probably going to bust out again as a big question now in the next 4 years, as those of us in academic life will probably come under pressure once again to teach creations in the classroom or to give both sides climate change denial. How do we distinguish between propaganda versus just honest political debate? Well, for one thing, NAM and others at the time described it as propaganda. There are documents, generally in public, NAM doesn't call it propaganda, but there are documents in which you can see them describing it as a propaganda campaign. And some of its critics, of course, criticized it as a propaganda campaign. But I would say more importantly, for us as historians, is that the key argument is false. And we can show that it was false. We can show that the facts of history don't support these central claims. The indivisibility thesis is, in fact, easily refuted by history. Capitalism and freedom are not indivisible. And there's lots of examples that show that. And economic freedom does not protect, much less guarantee, our other freedoms. If we think about the early 20th century, before the New Deal, before the Progressive Era, before all the regulations that Nan loved to hate, unregulated markets had produced the world of hurt and suffering. They had produced a world that was cruel and dangerous, that included widespread child labor, including children as young as 2 years old working in textile mills in Massachusetts. It included what William Blake, the poet, famously called the dark satanic mills, factories with brutal working conditions, starvation wages, no limits to the hours that could be demanded of workers, and dense pollution that affected not just the workers, but the communities around them. It included violent suppression of unions, such as the Blood Bowl coal strike in Colorado, Native American industrial assimilation schools, which the federal government just last week apologized for the first time, in which Native American children were forcibly removed from their communities. And of course, it included slavery. They also included something called the accident crisis. We actually begin the book with this story. This is something that was a major, major issue in the early 20th century that's been practically completely forgotten by Americans. But in the early 20th century, large numbers of workers were killed or seriously injured, incapacitated, or crippled on the job every single year. In the year 1900, 1 in 1,000 workers was killed on the job every year. That would be the equivalent of 1.5 million workers being killed today. So that would be like that COVID pandemic of industrial death every single year. And in fact, at the time, people talked about it as an epidemic of workplace death. In anthracite mining, 6% of workers were killed every single year, leaving their families with nothing, because this is before Social Security or workers' compensation. And in fact, in 1914, it would have been safer for a young man to go fight in World War I than to go work on the railroads or in an anthracite mine. And of course, the Great Depression was market failure on a giant scale. The Great Depression proved that the free market not only did not guarantee political freedom, many of you may know how Herbert Hoover famously crushed the, I forgot what it's called, the soldiers who hadn't been paid. The what army?
Bonus army.
The bonus army, right. I mean, so here are a group of Americans, veterans, protesting for their political rights, and Herbert Hoover finally crushes that strike. But it didn't even guarantee prosperity. We know that reckless financial speculation and unscrupulous business practices had played a significant role in the crash of 29. And one of the first things that FDR does when he becomes president is to declare a bank holiday to close the banks so they can figure out what to do to restore consumer faith in the economy and banks, which they do through a set of regulations, including the creation of the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation. And of course, this doesn't need to be belabored, but it does need to be said. American capitalism had not brought freedom to the 10 million Black Americans enslaved in the U.S. South. And if you stop and think about it for a minute, it's really appalling that a man like Milton Friedman can say capitalism guarantees freedom with a kind of reckless disregard of the 10 million people for whom it not only did not guarantee freedom, but actually stripped them of freedom. And we also know that unregulated markets were bad for political democracy. In the late 19th century, monopolies and trusts had led to vast accumulations of wealth by robber barons who corrupted both markets and political systems. There are lots of cartoons from the era showing that. The Sherman Antitrust Act was intended not just to protect against concentrations of corporate power in the marketplace, but also to protect democracy against corrupting concentrations of power. And that, when it proved to be not strong enough, it was strengthened by Congress in the 1914 Clayton Act. But what history shows, and there's hundreds of books on the progressive era and the New Deal that documented this, is that not all of this suffering, but an awful lot of it, a lot of this corruption, a lot of this denial of freedom was remedied by law and by regulation. And it did not lead to communism, socialism, or any form of dictatorship in this country. In fact, it strengthened democracy and civil society. It protected the freedoms of workers, children, and Black Americans. The point here is that in the 19th century, it was the so-called free market that brought us slavery, and it was the federal government that ended it. Okay, and so I think I can skip through this. I think I made these points. So all these facts were known to von Hayek when he wrote The Road to Serfdom in 1944, and they were known to Milton Friedman when he wrote Capitalism and Freedom in 1962. But these men brushed these facts of history aside in order to promote their political ideology. And again, that's why I think it is fair to call it market fundamentalism. It's not an empirical theory. It's not a scientific theory. It's not a testable theory about how markets operate. It's an assertion, an allegation intended to support certain political, social, and cultural goals. And in later years, after these books were published, there was still more evidence that proves the thesis wasn't true. So here are things that were not available to von Hayek and Friedman, but are available to us when we think about what is the proper role of governance in the marketplace. So in 1973, advised by Milton Friedman, the Chilean dictator Augusto Pinochet undertook economic liberalization under a brutal dictatorship that not only reduced political freedom of opponents, but murdered thousands. And here, many of the supporters of Friedman just straight out lie about this. They deny that Friedman was an advisor to Pinochet, but you can go on the internet and you can find letters that's been posted where Friedman is writing to the dictator saying, "Oh, it was so nice to meet you. I'm so glad we had a chance to talk," etc., etc. And many of the Chilean economists who advised Pinochet had studied at the University of Chicago, were followers of Friedman, to the point they were referred to as the Chicago Boys. And there are some books about this available now. And then there's China. China is such an interesting example. In 1978, China is almost like an experiment, a test of this theory, because in 1978, China instituted its open-door policy embracing market economics. Now, Milton Friedman and others were very excited about this at the time because they believed that political liberalization would necessarily follow. In a way, this really was a test of their theory, but it didn't. And so today in China, we have a form of a governance or a kind of political economy that we don't even really have a word for, because it's different from what anyone anticipated, but at least some people refer to it as market authoritarianism, because China has markets, and yet it has remained a stubbornly and steadfastly authoritarian system. Now, in 1962, Milton Friedman, of course, did not know what would later happen in Chile or in China, but he did know what had already happened in the United States, that American capitalism had not protected freedom, and that workers, consumers, and environmentalists had had to fight the American business community to protect their rights of freedom, and sadly, that is still the case today. The truth is that freedom is not protected by our form of distributing goods and services, but by our forms of governance. By how we behave, how we treat each other, how we think about these problems. The Yale historian Timothy Snyder has written, "A common American error is to believe that freedom is the absence of state authority." Eric and I argue that we now think we know, at least in part, why so many Americans make that error. Because for more than a century, this is what we've been consistently told by powerful people and organizations, to think about freedom as the absence of state authority, as opposed to the many other different ways that one might think about freedom. And of course, freedom means different things to different people. The word freedom is a complicated one, and whenever you have something complicated, it's always good to go back in history and think, well, how have people thought about this before? So it's very interesting to me that there's a very famous speech by Abraham Lincoln from 1864, and we think our country is polarized now, but we were even more polarized then. So in the depths of an incredibly bloody, painful war, Abraham Lincoln wrote this: "We all declare for liberty, but in using the same word, we do not mean the same thing. The shepherd drives the wolf from the sheep's throat, for which the sheep thanks the shepherd, while the wolf denounces him for the same act. as the destroyer of liberty. And I think we know who the wolves are today. Isaiah Berlin summarized it, liberty for wolves can be death for lambs. So in conclusion, after 20 years of working on this topic, Eric Conway and I have concluded that the merchants of Dow and other market fundamentalists resist accepting the truth about climate change and other forms of market failure because accepting it means accepting the reality of serious large-scale market failure, serious failures of capitalism. It means accepting the reality that unpaid external costs, what economists call the external costs, like pollution, are the Achilles heel of modern capitalism. Now, in recent years, important political and business leaders have begun to recognize this. Back in 2005, Nicholas Stern, the former chief economist of the World Bank, called anthropogenic global warming the greatest and widest-ranging market failure ever seen. And more recently, Klaus Schwab, the founder of the World Economic Forum in Davos, so again, not exactly a left-wing radical, wrote or stated in speech, free market fundamentalism has eroded workers' rights and economic security, triggered a deregulatory race to the bottom and ruinous tax competition, and enabled the emergence of massive new global monopolies. Well, I couldn't have said that better myself, except the weird thing is that he leaves out the climate crisis, which is arguably the biggest market failure of them all. And as the novelist Kim Stanley Robinson has told us, the truth is that the invisible hand never picks up the check. Thank you very much.
All right, at this time, we're going to start the Q&A, so we'll just get set up here. So thank you so much, Dr. Oreskes, for that wonderful talk. So we have about 20 minutes here together as a group, and so at this time, we would love to open the floor, and I will facilitate the discussion from there. So if anyone has questions, please raise your hand, and we will have someone bring the microphone around to you.
I have two questions. One was a kind of specific historical question, and one is more contemporary. So I'm wondering if you could say a little bit more about what was up at University of Chicago in that era. So what connections were there, if any, between the Chicago School of Economics and the Manhattan Project, a kind of atomic research happening there? So I had never really thought much about that.
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't know of any specific example that links this story to the Manhattan Project. It's a really interesting question. I really don't know. All I can say is the Chicago School was already kind of on the laissez-faire side of the spectrum of economic thinking in the 1920s and 30s, but it was not nearly as doctrinaire as it becomes after World War II. And part of our argument is that we show how these business, these industrialists cultivated the sort of most extreme member of Chicago School of thinking, so that the Chicago School came to be associating with the extreme views that we, know today. And it's also an important part of the story. If you read Angus Bergen's work or Quinn Slobodian and others, a number of people make the point that if you look at the arguments about neoliberalism that are taking place in Europe in the 1930s, it's a pretty broad-ranging argument about what neoliberalism means and how governments should respond to the Great Depression. People recognize that you can't just stand back and do nothing, right? And at one point, Milton Friedman even says that. He says neoliberalism got a little discredited because people thought you should do nothing in the face of a catastrophe. I mean, that's the Hoover story. So there's this very broad and interesting conversation taking place. And one of the things that we argue, Lanau, Prang, and the others in the story do, is they cultivate a particular interpretation of neoliberalism, promote that interpretation, and so some other, what, say, to me personally might be more reasonable and more palatable interpretations get pushed aside.
My second question kind of stems from that, this piece of the story where you say that some of these individuals, groups went to Princeton who said, no thanks, and then University of Chicago kind of welcomed them in. In this era that we live in, where there is so much infiltration or connection between private funding and the courting of private donors within higher education, I feel like it also is that problem is insidious for a number of reasons. One is it makes it harder to do critical research on that phenomenon itself.
Right.
But I'm wondering, it's not your research precisely, but if you could say more about that contemporary phenomenon, which is so pervasive, and then also at some point I'd love to find out some good resources to read more academic research on that.
Yeah, well, it's a really important question. I think that our work certainly speaks to the idea that academics really need to stand up and be counted in pushing back on the encroachment. And I'm going to deliberately use their word, the encroachment of private sector interests on academic research. And I think we have lots and lots of evidence of why that's problematic, not just from our story, but from the history of tobacco research, the history of Coca-Cola's distortion of nutrition research, the sugar industry. There's already a big literature on that I can point you to. And it can be tricky because often we have administrators, and I have had them in my own life, deans, provosts, people we like, people who are good people who have PhDs themselves, and who say things like, well, we have no choice because federal, state funding has gone down. The only way to support the university is with public-private partnerships, and it's a good thing. These are great. These are good corporations that want to help us and blah, blah, blah. And it's not to say that public-private partnerships are always bad. I mean, I can think of some cases where they could be good, but I think they are actually really problematic, and it's really important for us as academics to say, wait, hold on, they are problematic, and they're problematic because they undermine academic integrity. And that's what we hear about, right? If our work becomes compromised, then at some point, we're always hearing about those people out there who don't trust us, don't like us, they think we're liberal elites, we're out of touch, and they blame it on our, quote, alleged left-wing politics, much of which is grossly exaggerated. But I actually think we have evidence that some of the public distrust of academia is because they actually see the ways in which academic research has already been corrupted, particularly in the area of nutrition. And so, think about all the people out there who voted for Robert Kennedy. And, if you haven't actually read any of his laws, you should read them, because it's really an interesting intellectual challenge, because probably 60 to 70% of what he says is insane, and it's definitely the writings of a man with a worm in his brain. But then there's the other 30 to 40% about corruption at CDC or co-optation of academics, and that part is not crazy. And so, if we can't clean up our own house and make sure the work we do is as objective as possible, obviously there's no such thing as 100% objectivity, but as objective as possible, subject to peer review, subject to open competition, no hiring people behind closed doors. If we don't stand up for those basic principles, then I think the public are right in distrusting us.
Well, and it goes back to we are at such a moment of distrust overall, right? So looking at the numbers on total trust in institutions and kind of where we are today and how that influences how we talk about science and how we talk about several different things.
Right, but just add one thing to that. But if you look at particularly the Pew Research results on this, because in my other parts of my life I spend lots of time with Pew findings, even though trust in science has declined, it's declined much less than other things. So actually, overall, most people still do trust science, and American Academy of Arts and Sciences did a big report a couple of years ago that showed that about 70 to 72% of Americans still have high levels of trust in science and technology, and feel strongly that the government should be funding science and technology. So those are actually quite high numbers, but it means we need to do work, first of all, to better understand what are the conditions that make people trust science and what are the conditions not, because often these surveys they're kind of yes, no, we don't really get at the underlying ideas, but also to figure out what do we need to do to sustain that, especially since we're for sure going to be facing 4 years of, renewed attacks on academic science.
And question right here.
Thank you. Thank you so much for your work and your scholarship over the last decades. I've appreciated it deeply. This is a political problem. We can't use scientific arguments to counter the political arguments. Give us some hope, some tools for how to proceed with having productive conversations with those who forward these false ideas.
Yeah. Well, that's a great question. Of course, it depends who it is. There are some people who are incredibly entrenched and whose views you'll probably never change, and it may not be a good use of your time and energy to try, right? So, if people believe that, astronauts never landed on the moon, then that might be a lost cause. But one of the we know is that when you dig at least even a little bit below the survey data, what you find is a lot of people who really don't know what to think. And that's where there's an opportunity for productive engagement. And I think that kind of engagement can happen on a couple of different levels. So it's been fashionable to say in recent years that facts don't matter because there's so much, non-factual stuff going around. But I don't think that's really true. I think that for most people, facts actually still do matter, but they don't know whose facts to believe, and they don't know where these facts are coming from. And so one thing that I found is helpful is if someone asks a question, you don't just say, oh, it's X. You say it's X, and let me explain to you how we know that. So I used to get asked all the time, well, how do we know that it's not just climate change isn't just natural variability? And then I would say, oh, thank you for that question, because that gives me the opportunity to tell you the story of my good friend Ben Santer, who's the scientist who answered that question. And then you even have an opportunity to teach people a little bit of science, the difference between the troposphere and the stratosphere, which even the Supreme Court didn't know, So there's kind of like, what we would call a teachable moment. And I find that if you do that in a non-condescending way, like not, oh, you're an idiot that you asked this question, but that's actually a great question because even Antonin Scalia in the Mass versus EPA case didn't know the difference between the stratosphere and the troposphere. So that's one thing. And then the other thing I found, particularly when I present talks about the Merchants of Doubt work, and essentially this is all a big con game, right? These are rich, powerful people trying to con us into believing stuff that serves their interest and not ours. And I think the reality is no one wants to be the sucker, right? No one wants to be the loser on the losing side of a shell game, right? So to the extent that you can tell this story as a story of people who are really trying to pull the wool over our eyes to serve their interests. ExxonMobil made like $3 trillion last year, leaving us, the American taxpayer, with the bill, the $80 billion that we're now going to be paying to clean up Hurricane Milton and Hurricane Helene. So, they're laughing all the way to the bank. So again, depending on who the audience is, there are different strategies that can work. And then the third thing is teachers. So I've been on the board for several years in the National Center for Science Education. And one of the things we found, and I found this in my own life personally, teachers are really hungry for good educational materials, but there's a lot of junk out there, and they get propaganda. They get Cato Institute, Heartland Institute propaganda sent to them in the mail. And so to the extent that we can support teachers with good quality information, then that helps us make sure we get good information to the next generation.
And do you have any advice, since you are a School of Journalism and Communication, for those students who are looking to go into journalism, PR, or advertising to think about how do they enter this space in a way, listening to all the lessons that you learned throughout your work?
Well, of course, advertising and journalism are two fairly different things. I guess the people who are going to go into advertising, I don't want to say that all advertising is bad, although I do think a lot of it is bad. But, there is a difference between advertising. I sort of like use the example of a pair of shoes that you like. So I really like these shoes. They're comfortable, and I think they look fun, and they get on and off easily on an airplane. And so if I see an ad for the company that makes these shoes, and they're showing me the latest styles or the latest colors, I think that's fine. That's a kind of information that a consumer can use. And you could say, yeah, nice shoes, but I'm not going to pay that much money. So there's nothing deceptive or false about that. But then there's the advertising, like Coca-Cola's big campaign on energy balance, right? To claim that, the problem wasn't that we were drinking sugar-sweetened drinks. The problem, it was our fault because we weren't getting enough exercise. And that was a very malicious and frankly despicable advertising campaign for several reasons. Because first of all, it's a classic example of disinformation because it has a kernel of truth. Yes, exercise is important. And yes, Americans don't exercise enough. And yes, exercise actually is medicine. We have lots of evidence that you will be healthier if you exercise. But we also have a lot of evidence that the primary reason Americans are obese is because of what's happened to our food supply in the last 30 or 40 years. And the huge amounts of additional calories that many Americans take in through sugar-sweetened beverages like Coca-Cola, which are massively marketed everywhere, including on university campuses, right? And so you would be, if you drink 2 cans of Coke a day, you'd have to run like 2 hours every day to make up for that. Very few people are wanting to do that. So it was a very misleading campaign, classic example of blaming the victim. And it also perpetuated something that was truly a falsehood. A lot of misleading advertisement, the word misleading is right. It's misleading, it's deceptive. It's not exactly a lie, but it's kind of misleading in context. But Coke pushed the idea that a calorie is a calorie is a calorie. That's a lie. That's false. We have really good science that shows that a calorie from a sugar-sweetened drink is much more damaging than a calorie from, let's say, eating an orange, which is not as good as a calorie from oatmeal, right? I mean, there's a spectrum of different kinds of foods, some which carry a lot of nutritional value, plus also might be good for our microbiomes, and some of which cause insulin spikes and lead to type 2 diabetes. So a calorie is not a calorie. And we know that Coca-Cola knew that when they ran these ad campaigns. So that's where I would say that if you're working for an advertising agency that is doing a campaign like that, then you have to sit down and have a hard talk with yourself, right, about right livelihood. And there are ad groups. There's a group called Clean Creatives. Yeah. So, there are ad groups that are addressing this, that are trying to encourage advertising agencies not to work. It's a kind of divestment, right? Not to work with a company like Coca-Cola that is engaged in deceptive and fraudulent advertising. And obviously there's a spectrum, and everyone's got to figure out. And this is why that was important to be educated, because there are some really good books on this, like Mayor Nestle's Soda Politics. You might, if you didn't read and study, you might not know the recent science that says, no, actually different calories are really different. And on a sort of primitive basis, saying a calorie is a calorie, it seems plausible if you don't know the science, or it seems plausible, well, weight is about, calories in, calories out. On some level, that's partly true, but it's definitely not the whole story.
Thank you.
Next question in the background.
Okay.
All right, so my question is, you keep talking about disinformation and perceptions and distrust in information, but what if it's, I'm interested to know, what if it's more about the ignorance is bliss argument? Personally, I would love to be the perfect consumer, because ultimately we're the ones making those decisions to buy or not buy Coca-Cola. But if I spent all my time reading on all the science and learning everything, I'll give a little bit of credit to Scalia there. He should know it, but he just can't possibly.
Well, his clerk should have known it.
Right. But the ignorance is bliss thing and not being a perfect consumer. I'm interested of what advice you would have to those who aren't able to look up everything they want to know, but do want to not come off as the people who are ignoring the science.
Yeah, that's a great question. And there's no question we all feel that. I feel it. There are times I go home and, I just want to watch TV. We all have that experience. So I'd say there's a couple of things about that. One is that I do think it's important for us to understand as human beings. Let me back up. We've been sort of trained to think of ourselves as consumers, right, as opposed to citizens or people. And I think one of the things I would really like to see us do is to try to figure out a way how to reclaim our identities primarily as citizens rather than as consumers. And it's not to say that we won't still buy stuff. Of course we will. We have to buy some stuff like food, clothing, and shelter. But I think that American marketing has really worked hard to try to lead us to embrace the idea of ourselves as consumers, and that a lot of our identity is tied up with what clothing we wear, or what vacations we take, or even what water bottle we have. And that we do have to kind of consciously push back against that. And it doesn't mean you need to do a ton of research on a particular product. It means, just kind of pushing back to say, well, do I really need another water bottle? Is the one I have still functional? And I have to say, I get given water bottles all the time. I got given one today, which is nice because they're good water bottles, and I give them to friends and families and my graduate students who need them. But, a lot of times we buy stuff we don't really need. And it does require a certain kind of mental habit or mental practice to say, yeah, that's a fun-looking water bottle, but I don't need it. And that, it's hard on one level, but I also think it's not that hard once you kind of get in the habit of it. And then the other thing I would say is, it's not realistic. I don't think it's realistic to expect every person to be doing their own research. I think that's actually a bad model. I actually think that's kind of my job, actually. The reason why I write the books I do is so that you don't have to, right? So you could read my books and learn about this, or you could read Miriam Nestle's book on soda politics and learn about that. So there are good books out there. So for the academics in the audience, I think it's really important that we continue to do this kind of work, because it creates a counterbalance we go on social media, we watch television, streaming, whatever it is. We are all bombarded all day long by marketing and advertising, encouraging us to buy the latest thing or go to the latest trendy place or whatever it is. But as academics, we can offer a little bit of a counterweight to that to say, well, things don't go better with Coke. Actually, what goes with Coke is type 2 diabetes.
Well, with that, I actually think that we are at time. And so I want to thank everybody for coming. And thank you so much.